Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the mysterious case of the Kentucky twins that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. From the private journals of Dr. Edmund Falk, alienist, London, October 1881. London's fog pressed against my study window as I recorded the most perplexing case of my career. At its heart was 10-year-old Alice Whitby, a child who, by all accounts, should have been a living testament to a generous act of charity. Instead, she had become the epicenter of a horror no rational mind could yet explain. The whispers of the Pembroke servants about a curse were far more chilling than any medical diagnosis I had ever considered. I, a man of science, found myself grappling with a mystery beyond the known frontiers of our world. As I leafed through my notes, I saw the horrifying timeline of events unfold. Diary entries of the late governess, found after her fatal fall, described an increasing dread of Alice's hollow-eyed doll and the child's habit of standing silently at her bedside at midnight. Maids swore they heard giggles in empty rooms and found small dead animals on thresholds like morbid gifts. At the heart of it all was Alice herself, a cherubic smile, golden curls, and a disconcerting, knowing calm. Her unblinking poise was what unnerved me most. I had never seen a child meet the news of a violent death with such polite indifference. The questions mounted. Was she a victim of trauma, a calculating prodigy of evil, or something even more frightening? As I wrote, the wind howled over the rooftops, and the clock of Big Ben tolled 3. In that resonance, I sensed a darkness no rational mind could yet explain. The city of London, 1881, was a place of jarring contrasts. In the East End district of Whitechapel, workhouses and slum alleys teemed with destitute souls. From this grim reality, where rats scurrying over sleeping bodies was a common sight, emerged young Alice Whitby. She was born in a grim fortress, learning not to cry or flinch, possessing an unsettling composure. A matron recalled the girl's demeanor was queer, even when other babes screamed. Little Alice just watched with those big, pale eyes, quiet as a ghost. Meanwhile, in Kensington, the wealthy took tea and enjoyed lavish townhouses. Into this world of comfort, Mr. and Mrs. Pembroke, a childless couple known for their philanthropic zeal, resolved to adopt an orphan. They imagined saving an innocent soul, but their society was caught between scientific optimism and a fascination with spiritualism. Mr. Pembroke believed a good upbringing could reform any bad habit. His wife, Helena, wondered if a sorrowful spirit clung to the girl. This tension would become the foundation of their eventual tragedy. On a bleak March morning, Alice was brought from the East End, behind the facade of civility. Shadows began to gather. The household staff found her uncanny. She was eerily well-behaved, accepting new clothes and meals with calm gratitude, but little excitement. Her obedience should have been a relief, but it unnerved them. The cook whispered, "It ain't natural for a child to be so quiet." Alice's only obvious attachment was to her tattered rag doll, Charlotte, which never left her side, despite being gifted many new toys. She tucked them neatly away, returning to her beloved doll. This struck the staff as odd. The scullery maid, prone to superstition, muttered that the doll must house a spirit, or that Alice was a changeling. Mrs. Pembroke, while outwardly dismissing such talk, could not ignore the unsettling feeling. One night, she heard Alice murmuring to Charlotte, reciting a nursery rhyme in a tone so flat it sounded like a funeral rite. When Helena gently asked whom she was speaking to, Alice replied, "Only Charlotte. Mama, she can't sleep, so I'm keeping her company." A deep sense of dread ran down Helena's spine. The polite curtsies and replies served as a mask, hiding a nature that was anything but benign. The governess, Miss Doyle, was the first to witness the true Alice. She found the child a bright pupil, but soon her peculiar behavior unnerved her. One day, Alice interrupted a lesson to ask, "Miss Doyle, have you ever seen a person die?" Miss Doyle later confided to me, Dr. Falk, that it was the manner in which she asked. Like one asks about the weather, no child should speak of death so coldly. Another incident solidified Miss Doyle's growing fear. She found Alice in the schoolroom, a dead butterfly meticulously pinned to paper and cut open with shears. "I wanted to see how it worked," Alice explained calmly. These were small, unsettling moments, dismissed by Mr. Pembroke as childish curiosity, but to Miss Doyle, they were the first signs of a chilling void. The family dog, Brutus, also sensed this darkness. He was strangely agitated around Alice, barking frantically at her door. One afternoon, a maid witnessed Brutus snarling at Alice from the doorway. Alice simply stood there, staring, until the dog whimpered and hid. The next day, Brutus fell violently ill, vomiting and bleeding from the mouth, and did not survive. Mr. Pembroke assumed rat poison, but the cook swore she had seen Alice near a broken jar in the pantry. Mr. Pembroke, furious, threatened to sack anyone spreading malicious gossip. The accidents did not stop. A neighbor's child, Emily, was invited for a playdate and was left in the nursery with Alice. Within an hour, Emily was crying inconsolably. Later, word came that Emily had a broken arm after a fall from the nursery window. Alice said Emily leaned too far, but Miss Doyle noted the window latch was oddly slick with grease. After that, neighborhood mothers kept their children away. Within a week, Miss Doyle gave her notice on her last day. She confided to me that she feared being alone with Alice, feeling watched like a predator in the tall grass might watch a hare. Servants began to leave in droves. Mrs. Pembroke was pale with strain, and Mr. Pembroke was bewildered by the hysteria. I was more intrigued than ever, maintaining a special case journal titled The Whitby Enigma. I was torn between a psychological disorder and the wild theories of curses or possession. As a man of science, I leaned toward the former, but the pattern was growing dark. Could a 10-year-old plot deliberate harm? I needed more evidence, and fate was about to provide it in blood and terror. The stage was set. Alice, the prim child with the eerie calm, the anxious mother and skeptical father, the alienist and the superstitious servants. The uneasy equilibrium would not hold. That event came on a gray September morning. A piercing scream shattered the quiet. It was Mrs. Pembroke. At the foot of the grand staircase lay a crumpled figure, Miss Eliza Crowley, the new governess, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. A broken section of banister hung loose on the landing 3 stories up. The horrifying picture was clear. Miss Crowley had fallen. Mrs. Pembroke stood transfixed, while Alice was a small silhouette halfway up the staircase. Fully dressed, in her arms, as ever, was Charlotte. Alice's reaction was unnerving in its lack of drama. "She must have slipped," Alice said softly, her tone eerily calm. Her eyes flicked to me. "Dr. Falk," as I arrived, and she offered, "Miss Crowley is hurt." "Who hurt?" The word was grotesquely inadequate. I felt a chill as I regarded the child. While others were in bedlam, Alice remained composed. The doctor confirmed death was instantaneous, as the constable was summoned. My gaze noted a detail, a handprint on the banister. It was a tiny smear in the dust, too small for an adult's palm, and a hint of something red. I discreetly pocketed a sample. The shape undeniably resembled Alice's slender hand. If Alice had pushed her, the thought seemed unthinkable. Yet, I could not ignore the possibility. "The police ruled Miss Crowley's death an accident." Mr. Pembroke was relieved, insisting there was a rational explanation. But Helena could no longer be placated. Her chill had solidified into icy fear. The household staff saw their worst fears confirmed. They would scatter whenever Alice passed, her silent footsteps echoing in the hallways. The once vibrant house became a mausoleum of whispered fears. But the final act had yet to be performed. Mr. Pembroke's 12-year-old cousin, Julian, a lively and inquisitive boy, was sent to stay with them. One afternoon, Julian and Alice were left to play in the library. Julian, an adventurous boy, found a small, unmarked bottle of brandy and, to show off, took a quick sip himself. Within minutes, the boy collapsed. He died within the hour. The cause of death was attributed to a rare poison, a cyanide compound, accidentally ingested from a mislabeled bottle. I was immediately called. I found Alice seemingly unfazed. When questioned, she calmly explained that she had been in the library with Dr. Julian but had remained at a distance. When I asked about the bottle, she said, "Julian was very curious. Dr. Falk, he wanted to try everything." Her words were innocent, but her eyes held a chilling emptiness. The tragedy broke Mr. Pembroke's fragile composure. He was furious at the public spectacle. As rumors of a curse spread, it was then I decided to take a direct approach, observing Alice as a detective. My search led me to her rag doll, Charlotte. I found a peculiar seam and, driven by curiosity, cut it apart. Inside, I found a small tin with macabre tokens, a tuft of fur from Brutus, a feather from Emily's fall, a shard of glass from the pantry, and a vial with a faint trace of cyanide. But the most terrifying discovery was the tiny, leather-bound journal tucked in the doll's stuffing. The handwriting was a child's scrawl, but the words were the musings of a monster. It was a clinical record of her experiments, detailing Brutus's death and Emily's fall with chilling precision. Her final entry was a note about Julian's anatomy and a drawing of a skeleton with a little red heart in its chest. My discovery was the definitive proof. Alice was not a victim of trauma. She was a budding sociopath, an empty vessel with no empathy. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted Mr. Tishteta Pembroke. He was in utter disbelief, but when I showed him the journal, His rational world crumbled. He had not saved an orphan, but had welcomed a predator. The family chose to make the problem disappear. Mr. Pembroke ensured all the deaths were officially ruled accidents and falsified police reports. They spread a story that Alice had been sent away for her nervous disposition. The truth was buried to protect the family's name. But the truth haunted its keepers. Mrs. Pembroke, broken, descended into deep depression. Mr. Pembroke, once a man of logic, became a ghost in his own home. The once grand home was now a prison of fear and guilt. The Pembrokes sent Alice to a distant boarding school under a new name, but she was not a girl who could be corrected. She was an enigma, a beautiful facade with a cold, hollow core. I never saw her again, but her story, my story, did not end there for years. I was haunted by the memory of that empty-eyed child, and my mind often returned to the question, was she a victim, a prodigy of evil, or something more frightening? My journals, filled with the details of the Whitby enigma, were a testament to a mind no science could save. It was a secret that I and the Pembrokes carried to our graves. The story, however, has a chilling epilogue. Years later, in the same foggy streets of London's East End, a series of gruesome murders began to terrorize the city. The killer, a phantom known as Jack the Ripper, committed his crimes with a chilling precision. The victims were often found with their organs surgically removed, as if the killer had a morbid curiosity about human anatomy, and a rumor circulated that a ghostly figure, a girl with golden curls and an unnerving calm, was seen near the crime scenes. I knew it was impossible, a mere hallucination of a man haunted by his past, but sometimes, when I would hear the chimes of Big Ben, I would be certain that the darkness I had sensed in Alice had never left. The Pembrokes' charitable act had a far darker consequence than they could have ever imagined. The orphan they had tried to save had become a monster who would forever haunt the streets of London and the memory of all who had the misfortune of knowing her. The child science couldn't save was not a victim, but a chilling testament to the banality of evil. And it was a lesson I, Dr. Falk, would never forget. The tragic death of Miss Eliza Crowley, a young woman hired with the hope of restoring a semblance of order to the increasingly chaotic Pembroke household, was not merely an accident. It was the chilling crescendo of a macabre symphony that had been playing since Alice's arrival. Her body lay a crumpled heap at the foot of the grand staircase, a testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of gravity. Mr. Pembroke, a man whose life was built on the solid bedrock of rationality, found himself in an emotional maelstrom. His public face, a stoic mask of grief and composure, was at odds with the private turmoil within. He was torn between his need to protect his family's reputation and a dawning, terrifying doubt about the child he had so nobly adopted. Helena, his wife, had long since abandoned the facade of normalcy. She was a woman unraveling, her hands trembling, her eyes hollow, and her whispers filled with a paranoia her husband dismissed as hysteria. The house, once a beacon of social standing, had become a prison of unspoken fears. Each creak of the floorboards a torment, each gust of wind a spectral whisper. The official inquiry, a perfunctory affair conducted by a constable whose greatest ambition was a quiet afternoon, quickly concluded the death to be an unfortunate accident. The shattered vase, the broken banister, the dim light of dawn, it was all a perfectly rational explanation for a misstep. Case closed. But for Dr. Edmund Falk, the alienist whose expertise was a labyrinth of the human mind, The matter was far from settled. He found himself haunted by the small dusty handprint he had observed on the banister, a mark too small to be Miss Crowley's, and the unsettling smear of red he had found upon closer inspection. It was a detail that defied the official narrative, an anomaly in a case that was supposed to be neatly concluded. Driven by a professional curiosity that was now bordering on obsession, Dr. Falk began his own silent, clandestine investigation. He spoke to the remaining servants, whose fear had become so profound it was almost palpable. They spoke in hushed tones of objects moved in the night, of faint giggles echoing from empty rooms, and of the unblinking, unsettling presence of Alice's rag doll. Charlotte, one scullery maid, her face pale with terror, recounted a chilling tale of waking in the night to find Charlotte perched on the foot of a bed, its empty button eyes seeming to watch her, only for the doll to vanish with the first light of dawn. The Pembroke household was not haunted by a ghost, it was tormented by a living, breathing malevolence in the guise of a little girl. Falk's initial hypothesis of a deeply traumatized child was beginning to give way to a more horrifying and less scientific conclusion. He saw her now not as a victim, but as a predator, a creature without a conscience. And his professional detachment was slowly being replaced by a personal dread. The air in the Pembroke home, already thick with unspoken tension, grew colder still with the arrival of Mr. Pembroke's cousin, Julian, a spirited boy of 12. Julian was a stark contrast to the morbid atmosphere that now permeated the house. He was full of life, with a contagious curiosity that found wonder in every corner of the grand old house. He was a breath of fresh air, a jarring note of innocence in a place of deepening gloom. Mr. Pembroke, desperate to cling to the illusion of a normal, happy home, encouraged the children to play together, believing that Julian's jovial nature would be a positive influence on Alice. But Julian, with his inquisitive mind and boundless energy, was less a balm and more a catalyst for the escalating horror. One afternoon, left to their own devices in the vast library, Julian's attention was drawn to a locked glass-fronted cabinet. It contained a collection of rare, exotic items, including a row of unmarked bottles. With a mischievous glint in his eye, he found a way to jimmy the lock and produced a small, elegant bottle containing a clear liquid, eager to impress Alice, who watched from a distance with her unnerving calm. He took a sip. What followed was a scene of unparalleled terror. Julian collapsed, clutching his stomach, his face contorted in a silent scream. A searing, invisible fire consumed him from the inside out. He died within the hour, a tragic victim of what was officially labeled a rare, mislabeled cyanide compound, accidentally ingested. The official report, signed by a coroner with a weary shrug and a preference for a quiet life, satisfied the authorities. But Dr. Falk, summoned to the scene, was not so easily convinced. He found Alice standing apart from the chaos, her face placid, her hands gently smoothing the fabric of her doll's dress. When questioned, she looked up with those pale, impassive eyes and said, "Julian was very curious. Dr. Falk, he wanted to try everything." The public scandal was immediate and devastating. The city, which had once praised the Pembroke's benevolence, now whispered of a curse. Their once grand house was shunned, the servants who remained living in a state of perpetual terror. Mr. Pembroke, his rational world shattered, descended into a bitter fury, not at Alice, but at the injustice of it all. He was a man drowning in a sea of public judgment, clinging desperately to a belief in logic that no longer held any sway. His wife, Helena was a ghost in her own home, her mind broken by the successive tragedies. With the weight of this new tragedy, Dr. Falk's investigative obsession reached a fever pitch. The handprint on the banister, the poison, the peculiar stillness of Alice's demeanor. He saw not isolated incidents, but a pattern of clinical, methodical cruelty. He realized the police, with their focus on the mundane, would never see the truth. The burden of this monstrous secret fell squarely on his shoulders, a weight so heavy it threatened to crush him. He knew he had to prove it. He had to expose the monster hiding behind the cherubic smile. My search led me back to the one constant in Alice's life, the one inanimate object that seemed to hold all her affection, her doll. Charlotte. I had always found the doll unsettling, but now it seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a vessel for the child's malevolence, my mind, now acting as much as a detective, as an alienist. Recalled the strange seam on the doll, crudely sewn as if to hide something. With a trembling hand, I retrieved the doll and, in the privacy of my study, carefully cut the thread. Tucked deep inside the stuffing was a small, flat metal tin, no bigger than a matchbox. My breath caught in my throat as I pried it open. Inside, meticulously arranged, were a series of macabre trophies, a tuft of fur from Brutus, the family dog, a small, grey feather from Emily's fateful fall, a tiny, glittering shard of glass from the shattered poison jar in the pantry. And finally, a small dog vial, still containing a faint trace of the same bitter almond smell that had filled the library after Julian's death. It was a collection of horrors, a silent testimony to a series of monstrous acts. But the most chilling discovery was not in the tin, but in the doll itself. Tucked deep within the stuffing was a tiny, leather-bound journal. The handwriting was a child's scrawl, but the words were the musings of a budding monster. It was not a diary of a lonely child, but a clinical record of her experiments. She wrote about Brutus's death with a detached curiosity, noting the time it took for the poison to take effect. She described the fall of Emily not as a tragedy, but as an observation of the effect of gravity on a moving body. She had documented everything with a chilling precision. Her final entry, a short note about Julian's anatomy and a drawing of a skeleton with a little red heart in its chest. My discovery was the definitive proof I had been seeking, a horrifying confirmation of my worst fears. Alice was not simply a victim of trauma or a child with a peculiar temperament. She was a budding sociopath, an empty vessel with no empathy or conscience. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted Mr. Pembroke. He was, at first, in utter disbelief. He refused to accept that his daughter, his living testament to benevolence, could be capable of such monstrous acts. But when I showed him the journal and the contents of the tin, his face went ashen. His rational world, built on order and logic, crumbled before his eyes. He realized that he had not saved an orphan, but had welcomed a predator into his home. The family, now facing complete ruin and social ostracism, had a choice. They could turn Alice over to the authorities and face a scandal that would forever tarnish their name. Or they could make the problem disappear. They chose the latter, using his influence. Mr. Pembroke ensured that all the deaths were officially ruled as accidents. The police reports were falsified, and the Pembrokes began to spread a story to their friends and family that Alice had been sent away to a private institution for her nervous disposition. The truth was buried, not just to protect Alice, but to protect the family's name. But the truth had a way of haunting its keepers. Mrs. Pembroke, broken by the loss of her child, descended into a deep depression, her sanity teetering on the edge. Mr. Pembroke, who had once prided himself on his control and logic, became a ghost in his own home, haunted by the knowledge of what he had allowed to happen. He could not look at his wife without seeing the consequences of his arrogance. The house, once a beacon of comfort, was now a prison of fear and guilt. Servants who knew the truth fled in terror, and those who stayed lived in a constant state of dread. The once grand home became a tomb of a forgotten monster, and Alice the Pembrokes arranged for Alice to be sent to a distant boarding school under a new name. A school where, they were told, strict discipline would correct her behavior. But Alice was not a girl who could be corrected. She was an enigma, a beautiful facade with a cold, hollow core. I never saw her again. But her story, my story, did not end there. For years, I was haunted by the memory of that small, empty-eyed child, and my mind often returned to the question that had plagued me since the beginning. Was she a victim of a traumatic past, a calculating prodigy of evil, or something even more frightening, something beyond human? My journals, filled with the horrifying details of the Whitby enigma, were a testament to a mind that no science could save, a case that no theory could explain. It was a secret that I and the Pembrokes carried to our graves, a buried truth that could never be told. The story, however, has a chilling epilogue. Years later, in the same foggy streets of London's East End, a series of gruesome murders began to terrorize the city. The killer, a phantom who stalked the night, was known only as Jack the Ripper. The murders, committed with a chilling precision, were accompanied by a peculiar set of details that always made me, and me alone, wonder. The victims were often found with their internal organs surgically removed, as if the killer had a morbid curiosity about the human anatomy. And there was a rumor that a ghostly figure, a girl with golden curls and an unnerving calm, was seen near the crime scenes. I knew it was impossible, a mere hallucination of a man haunted by his past. But sometimes, when I would hear the chimes of Big Ben muffled by the midnight fog, I would be certain that the darkness I had sensed in Alice had never left. The Pembrokes' charitable act had a far darker consequence than they could have ever imagined. The orphan they had tried to save had, in turn, become the one who could not be saved, a monster who would forever haunt the streets of London and the memory of all who had the misfortune of knowing her. The child science couldn't save was not a victim, but a chilling testament to the banality of evil. And it was a lesson I, Dr. Falk, would never forget. The shocking discoveries within Charlotte's doll, the Macabre collection of trophies, and Alice's chilling journal were not merely the ravings of a disturbed man. They were tangible, irrefutable evidence. My mind, once a fortress of scientific rationale, had been breached by a horror no textbook could explain. To validate my findings and, more importantly, to force Mr. Pembroke to confront the truth he had so desperately buried, I sought the expertise of an independent forensic specialist. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man known throughout London for his meticulous and unyielding commitment to scientific truth, was my chosen confidant. His laboratory, a study in clinical precision, was a world away from the musty scent of the Pembroke manor. When I presented him with the contents of the tin, the vial, and the journal, his demeanor remained impassive, a testament to years spent dissecting the grim mysteries of the human condition. He worked with a quiet intensity, his magnifying glass hovering over the tuft of dog fur and the tiny shard of glass. as if searching for a lost story in their molecular structure. His findings, meticulously documented in a formal report, were a hammer blow to the official narrative. The report, bound in a stark black cover, was a monument to a truth that no one wanted to see. Forensic analysis of the vial confirmed the presence of a potent cyanide compound, consistent with the cause of Julian's death. Dr. Finch's work went further, identifying a unique chemical signature that matched the contents of a discreetly sold photographic fixer. The microscopic traces on the shard of glass matched the composition of the shattered poison jar in the Pembroke pantry with a 99.9% certainty. Most damningly, a spectral analysis of the grey feather revealed a faint trace of a fast-acting paralytic substance, precisely calibrated to render a pigeon unable to fly, perfectly aligning with Emily's tragic fall. The evidence was a tapestry of cruelty, woven with the cold thread of premeditation. The report's final page was a verdict more damning than any court could deliver. The deaths were not accidents. They were, without a doubt, a series of deliberate acts orchestrated by a mind of profound darkness. Armed with this irrefutable report, I returned to the Pembroke Manor. Mr. Pembroke, his face etched with the torment of a man clinging to a lie, received me in his study. The air was thick with the dust of shattered illusions. When I placed Dr. Finch's report on his desk, his facade of composure finally broke. He read the pages, his eyes scanning the scientific jargon that confirmed his deepest fears. Until he reached the conclusion, the paper trembled in his hands, each shake a tremor in the foundation of his rational world. He was no longer the rational man of influence, but a father, a husband, and now an accomplice to a monstrous secret. His wife, Helena, entered the room and saw the report. Her eyes, once hollow with paranoia, filled with a terrible, lucid clarity. It was in that moment that the final dam of their shared silence broke, and the truth came flooding out. Helena, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, began her confession. She spoke of the objects moved in the night, not by a ghost, but by her own daughter. She recounted waking in the dead of night to find Alice standing over her bed, the child's face a mask of porcelain tranquility, devoid of emotion as she watched her mother sleep. Helena had feigned sleep, her body rigid with a fear so profound it was almost a physical weight. She confessed the small, unnerving gifts Alice would leave for her: a dead mouse on her tea tray, a spider web woven into the lace of her finest handkerchief. These were not the actions of a traumatized child, but of a sadist. The psychological horror of these events had slowly eroded her sanity. She had tried to speak of them, to beg her husband to see. But his dismissive reassurance had only made her feel more isolated and mad. Mr. Pembroke, his face buried in his hands, revealed a different kind of horror. He spoke of the rationalizations he had clung to, the elaborate justifications he had built to protect his family's honor and his own sanity. He had seen the subtle signs, the cold, calculating look in Alice's eyes, the faint, dispassionate smile she wore. He confessed to suppressing the initial reports, to silencing the whispers with money and influence, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, futile hope that it was all just a phase. He had chosen to see a fragile victim where I had seen a budding predator. His was a man of logic who had deliberately chosen to ignore the most damning evidence for the sake of a comfortable lie. He had not only failed to protect his family, but had become an active participant in their deception. The confessions were a torrent of psychological torment. They spoke of a mind so alien to the human condition that it defied comprehension. Alice was a ghost, not of the supernatural, but of the moral world. She was the absence of a soul, a vacuum where empathy should have been. Her every action, from the quiet terror she inflicted to the methodical experiments documented in her journal, was a testament to a cruelty born not of rage or madness, but of a chilling, detached curiosity. She was a monster, not in form, but in essence. With the truth now fully exposed, the Pembrokes were confronted with the grim reality of their choices. They had protected a monster, and in doing so, had destroyed themselves. The legal and social consequences were a quiet, suffocating descent into ignominy. Mr. Pembroke, using his vast network of influence, managed to officially rule the deaths as a tragic series of mishaps, falsifying police reports and silencing the few remaining witnesses with financial compensation. The story of Alice's nervous disposition and her placement in a distant private institution was a lie meticulously crafted to protect their name. The truth was buried deep, a secret shared only by 3 people. But secrets have a weight all their own. In the eyes of society, the Pembrokes became pariahs. Their home, once a hub of London's elite, was now a symbol of tragedy and quiet horror. They were no longer invited to social gatherings, their friends and acquaintances, guided by the cold wind of rumor, turned their backs. The Pembrokes lived out their days in a gilded cage, their immense wealth unable to buy back their reputation or their peace of mind. Mr. Pembroke, the man who had valued logic above all else, was tormented by the knowledge of his complicity. His belief in order and rationality was shattered, replaced by a profound, haunting guilt. He saw his wife's descent into madness as a direct consequence of his hubris. Helena, her fragile sanity finally breaking, was confined to a quiet room in the house, a ghost haunted by the memories of a child who had no soul. The house, once a beacon of benevolence, was now a tomb, a stark monument to a family's self-inflicted ruin. The tragic tale of the Pembrokes was not about a curse or a supernatural entity, but about a far more common and terrifying form of evil, the banality of a calculated malice, and the devastating consequences of those who choose to look away. The confession was a shattering moment, but it was just the beginning of the end for the Pembroke family. Mr. Pembroke went to great lengths to erase every trace of Alice from their lives. He burned all her belongings, including the doll Charlotte and its terrifying contents. He destroyed every photograph, every painting, every small token of her existence. He paid off every servant and tradesman, extracting solemn promises of silence. The cost was immense, both financially and spiritually. His vast fortune, built on shrewd investments and an impeccable reputation, was now being used to buy the silence of an entire city. He began to sell off parts of his estate, one by one, to fund his elaborate deception. Helena, now living in a world of her own, would often wander the house, her hands tracing the patterns of a wallpaper that was no longer there, her lips moving in silent conversations with a child only she could see. She would speak of the little girl who made the birds stop singing, or the quiet giggle in the attic. Mr. Pembroke was reduced to a shell of a man, his once sharp mind consumed by a single recurring thought: what if I had acted sooner? He lived in a constant state of internal interrogation, his own thoughts becoming a form of punishment. His guilt was a physical presence, a cold shadow that followed him from room to room. He was trapped in a prison of his own creation, a magnificent manor that was now nothing more than a tomb. The legal system, with its rigid reliance on tangible evidence, was an unwitting accomplice to their cover-up. The falsified police reports, the coroner's revised statements, and the sworn affidavits of the silenced witnesses created an impenetrable wall of official lies. The authorities, content with a closed case and a family that had faded into obscurity, never looked back. The Pembroke name became a whispered caution, A cautionary tale of a family that had lost its way. The society that had once courted them now held them at arm's length. The Pembrokes lived out their days in a gilded cage, their immense wealth unable to buy back their reputation or their peace of mind. The climax of their tragedy was not a public trial, but a slow, quiet, and horrifying unraveling. It was the moment Mr. Pembroke, sitting alone in his vast, empty study, realized that he had not just saved his family's name, he had condemned his soul. He had traded truth for a comfortable lie, and in doing so, had sentenced his wife to madness and himself to a life of haunted solitude. The great house, with its echoing halls and silent rooms, became a monument to their hubris, a testament to the tragic consequences of choosing to look away from a truth too terrifying to face. The family's legacy was not one of benevolence, but of a monstrous secret, a chilling echo in the silent corridors of London's high society. And Alice the Pembrokes arranged for Alice to be sent to a distant boarding school under a new name. But Alice was not a girl who could be corrected. She was an enigma, a beautiful facade with a cold, hollow core. I never saw her again, but her story, my story, did not end there. For years, I was haunted by the memory of that small, empty-eyed child, and my mind often returned to the question that had plagued me since the beginning. Was she a victim of a traumatic past, a calculating prodigy of evil, or something even more frightening, something beyond human? My journals, filled with the horrifying details of the Whitby enigma, were a testament to a mind that no science could save, a case that no theory could explain. It was a secret that I, and the Pembrokes, carried to our graves. The story, however, has a chilling epilogue. Years later, in the same foggy streets of London's East End, a series of gruesome murders began to terrorize the city. The killer, a phantom who stalked the night, was known only as Jack the Ripper. The murders, committed with a chilling precision, were accompanied by a peculiar set of details that always made me, and me alone, wonder. The victims were often found with their internal organs surgically removed, as if the killer had a morbid curiosity about the human anatomy. And there was a rumor that a ghostly figure, a girl with golden curls and an unnerving calm, was seen near the crime scenes. I knew it was impossible, a mere hallucination of a man haunted by his past. But sometimes, when I would hear the chimes of Big Ben muffled by the midnight fog, I would be certain that the darkness I had sensed in Alice had never left. The Pembrokes' charitable act had a far darker consequence than they could have ever imagined. The orphan they had tried to save had, in turn, become the one who could not be saved, a monster who would forever haunt the streets of London and the memory of all who had the misfortune of knowing her. The child science couldn't save was not a victim, but a chilling testament to the banality of evil. And it was a lesson I, Dr. Falk, would never forget. The curtain of silence the Pembroke family had so meticulously woven was not a shield, but a veil that only deepened their isolation. The truth, though officially buried under layers of falsified reports and hush money, found new life in the city's whispers. It became a social poison, seeping into the grand parlors and exclusive clubs of London's high society. Whispers, like a creeping mist, followed the Pembrokes wherever they went. The averted eyes, the polite but distant nods, and the sudden cessation of invitations to social gatherings spoke more damningly than any public trial. The name Pembroke, once a symbol of prestige and benevolence, became a chilling footnote in a cautionary tale, a story not about a ghost haunting a manor, but about a darkness nurtured within. The magnificent estate itself became a haunted monument, its sprawling gardens and opulent halls now viewed as symbols of a wealth stained by a monstrous lie. The social fabric of their world did not tear. It quietly unraveled, thread by thread, leaving them stranded on an island of their own making. The city, in its silent judgment, had condemned them to a prison of their own design, a fate far more agonizing than any public spectacle. Mr. Pembroke, once the epitome of a rational man, found his meticulously constructed world of logic crumbling. He had believed that truth was a matter of fact, and facts could be controlled. Now, he was a prisoner of the very truth he had tried to suppress. His mind, once a fortress of reason, became a battlefield where the ghost of his complicity fought an endless war. He lived in a constant state of internal interrogation, his own thoughts a relentless, gnawing punishment. He saw his wife's descent into a quiet, haunted madness not as a separate tragedy, but as a direct consequence of his fatal hubris. He had chosen to see a fragile victim where he should have seen a budding predator. And in that moment of self-deception, he had sealed their fates. Helena, the woman who had once stood as a pillar of grace, now wandered the silent halls, a ghost herself, her sanity shattered by a terror no one had believed. She was confined not by walls, but by the memories of a child who had no soul, a monstrous echo in the desolate corridors of her mind. The legal records, meticulously crafted to tell a simple, tragic story of grief and misfortune, stood as a stark and misleading historical artifact. For generations, historians would look back and see only the public-facing narrative, a sanitized version of events that spoke of a family's unfortunate decline. They would never uncover the hidden truth that a malevolent force, a child without empathy, had orchestrated a series of meticulous cruelties. But the legacy of that malice, of a soul untouched by conscience, was not confined to the quiet desperation of the Pembroke manor. It was a darkness that had been unleashed, a seed of cruelty that found new ground to grow, years later, in the same foggy streets of London's East End. A series of gruesome murders began to terrorize the city. The killer, a phantom who stalked the night, was known only as Jack the Ripper. The murders, committed with a chilling precision, were accompanied by a peculiar set of details that always made me, and me alone, wonder. The victims were often found with their internal organs surgically removed, as if the killer had a morbid curiosity about the human anatomy. And there was a rumor that a ghostly figure, a girl with golden curls and an unnerving calm, was seen near the crime scenes. It was a chilling epilogue to a story no one dared to write. The child science couldn't save was not a victim, but a chilling testament to the banality of evil. Her story became a philosophical question, a dark shadow cast over the heart of humanity. What if the greatest horrors are not the ones that attack from the outside, but the ones we nurture within our own homes? It was a story about the fragility of truth, the price of willful blindness, and the terrifying consequences of choosing to look away from a truth too terrifying to face. In the end, the great house, with its echoing halls and silent rooms, became a monument to their hubris, a testament to a family's self-inflicted ruin. The Pembroke family's legacy was not one of benevolence, but of a monstrous secret, a chilling echo in the silent corridors of London's high society. And as the fog rolls in from the Thames, blanketing the city in a cloak of mystery, one cannot help but wonder, did the darkness I sensed in Alice ever truly leave, or did it simply find a new host, a new stage, for its terrible, detached curiosity? Some secrets, it seems, are not meant to be solved, only to be carried in the cold dread of a whispered legend. The silence, which had been the family's greatest tool of preservation, became their final, inescapable torment. Mr. Pembroke, once a man of action, was now a man of stillness, spending his days in his vast empty study, staring at the empty space on his desk where the official report had once been. The report itself was gone, burned along with Alice's macabre keepsakes. But its contents were seared into his memory. The clinical language of Dr. Finch's findings: potent cyanide compound, paralytic substance, orchestrated acts of profound darkness, replayed in his mind like a broken record. He had believed that by destroying the evidence, he could destroy the truth. Instead, he had only made the truth his constant companion, a ghost that haunted him in every silent room, every empty chair. His once impeccable attire grew rumpled, his face a map of regret and sleepless nights. The great Pembroke estate, once a beacon of London's social scene, was a dying star, its light dimming day by day as its occupants faded into a living death. He would walk the halls at night, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, a lonely drumbeat in a house that had become a mausoleum. He would stop at the landing, the place where Emily had met her end, and look down at the cold marble, not seeing a tragic accident, but a calculated descent, a moment of cruelty that he had so desperately wished to be a lie. Helena's madness, in contrast, was a form of protection. She existed in a world separate from the harsh reality, a world where her Alice was still a beautiful, innocent child. Her conversations were with phantoms, her movements governed by an invisible, internal clock. She would occasionally speak of the dead animals, but her voice would be filled with a curious, almost childlike wonder, as if she were recounting a beautiful dream. "The little bird," she would whisper, "it just wanted to sleep." Mr. Pembroke would watch her, a silent, helpless witness to a self-imposed exile from sanity. He envied her. Her mind, so fragile, had chosen to break rather than face the brutal truth, while his, so logical and unyielding, was forced to confront it in 1,000 agonizing moments. The house, with its silent servants and shuttered windows, was the stage for their final, desperate tragedy. The grand piano remained untouched, its polished surface reflecting the ghosts of parties long past. The library, once a testament to a thirst for knowledge, now housed only books that mocked him with their certainty and logic. They had everything and nothing. They had bought their freedom from public judgment at the cost of their souls. The end of the Pembroke family was a quiet one, unceremonious and unrecorded in the history books. Helena passed away first, a silent, peaceful passing in her sleep, her mind finally free from the horrors that had confined it. Mr. Pembroke, now utterly alone in the grand, desolate manor, lasted only a few months more. His death, officially attributed to a sudden decline, was a quiet surrender. He was found in his study, slumped in his favorite leather chair, a portrait of Alice, the one he had tried to burn but could not, clutched in his hand. The great estate, with no heirs to claim it, was eventually sold and converted into a public museum, a final, ironic twist of fate. Historians, with only the public records to guide them, would document its conversion and the unfortunate decline of its previous owners. They would note the strange, pervasive chill in the west wing, a lingering coldness that no amount of heating could dispel, and the uncanny feeling of being watched, a sensation that every visitor to the museum would report. The truth of the Whitby enigma, of the little girl with the soul of a monster, was a truth that was never meant for the public. It was a truth too terrible to be contained by courtrooms or headlines. It was a story about a darkness that exists not in dusty attics or whispered legends, but in the most beautiful and unexpected of places. It was a stark reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some questions are not meant to be answered, and some horrors are not meant to be understood. The tale of the Pembrokes, of Julian, of Emily, and of the innocent-looking child at the center of it all, was not a ghost story. It was a far more chilling and profound philosophical puzzle. A timeless question about the nature of evil and of the fragility of human reason. It was a lesson about the banality of malevolence and the devastating, unyielding consequences of those who choose to ignore it. The darkness that Alice brought into the world did not die with her or her family. It was a chilling testament to the terrifying idea that evil is not an external force to be fought, but a capacity to be nurtured, a seed that, once planted, can grow into a horrifying and unstoppable legacy. The echoes of a silent house and a monstrous secret still linger in the silent corridors of London, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not born, but made, and that their stories are never truly over.